All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope this Friday finds you doing well. We got one more full week, and then we've got fall break, which is kind of crazy, right? That's really coming quick. We're going to continue today with our topic of muscles. This will probably take us through today and into Monday. Just as a quick aside, I'm almost done grading your exams, and I'll have those scores back for you on Monday in class. So I'm going through right now. Overall, the class did really well. You'll be glad to know. So today's agenda, I got something a little different today. Really going to mix it up, keep everyone on their toes. We're going to do a ticket in instead of a ticket out. If you can believe that, it's going to happen. Then we're going to talk about the gross anatomy of muscles, and you'll learn what the longest muscle is in your body. I promised this on Wednesday, and I didn't deliver, but I'll deliver today. We're going to do a short activity, and you're going to quiz your neighbor because neighbors love to be quizzed. We'll see how far we get with muscles, like I said, and we'll finish up on Monday what we don't get to today. And then I've got some reminders at the end of class, and I'm just going to do, I was going to save this to the end of the semester, but I'm just doing it today. The greatest Venn diagram of all time. I know I'm talking that up, but once you see it, you won't disagree. So that's something to look forward to in about 47 minutes. So let's go ahead and get started. Quick review. We're going to do a ticket in today. So I want you to do this without looking at your notes. As best you can. We're going to name and define the 4 special properties of muscle tissue and then answer a few other short questions. So do this as best you can without looking at your notes. And the reason for that is I want to get a feel for what information you retain from our activities on Wednesday. So do your best with it. It's only graded for completion, not for correctness. I'm going to mark this down. Is the Wi-Fi being stupid?
I just got on the Wi-Fi.
Okay.
I tried to log in, but you would be right back.
It's 2 minutes. I see a lot of you still typing. Why don't we take another minute or so and answer the question?
I know, I'm not realizing it's
If you did that, that's fine. Just go ahead and leave it like that. I'll be able to see it. And you can, if the other answers are required, just put like a letter in there or something. That's fine. When you're done, just go ahead and rest your thumbs, and then I'll know if you're using your thumbs, creating an oppositional movement between your thumbs and your fingers. Okay. Looks like most of you have that wrapped up. You can expect, as you've seen, we've kind of hammered home these 4 properties of the muscle tissue. So you can definitely expect a question about that on your assessments. I think you've all got pretty good understanding of that from what I'm seeing. Any questions on that before we get into some new material here? All right, let's talk about the gross anatomy of skeletal muscles. So the rest of our time talking about muscles is going to focus on skeletal muscles. And in lecture, I'm also going to talk about some of the general anatomy that applies to most of the skeletal muscles. In lab, we'll look at the specifics, so naming particular muscles that perform particular motions, although you'll see some of them in lecture here. The first thing you need to know is that skeletal muscles move between bones that have different mobilities. And by mobilities, we mean the different ability to move, right? And so a great example here is your bicep. We'll use this one as an example a lot because it's kind of an easy example. And actually, excuse me, this isn't the bicep. This is the brachialis. The brachialis acts as what's called a synergist with the bicep. So it basically works with the bicep to produce the same motion, which is the flexion of the forearm. And here you can see that this muscle is attached to the humerus at what we call the origin and attached on the ulna at what we call the insertion. And what's important to note here is that when this muscle contracts, the ulna and with it the radius move in this example, but the humerus doesn't. And we define the different points of attachment of a muscle based on which part is moving and which isn't. And specifically, we refer to the origin as the attachment that is less movable. And that's a kind of loosely defined, and I'll talk about why that's loosely defined in a second here. But we call the origin of the muscle where it's attached, where it's kind of anchored, the part that doesn't move. And then the part that the attachment where the bone does move is called the insertion. And that is more the bone that's going to move when that muscle contracts. Now, generally speaking, but not always, the origin is more proximal or closer to the axis of the body, and the insertion is going to be more distal. So generally, you're flexing muscles that are closer to your axial skeleton, and that's producing a motion that's distal. So for example, I can flex my brachialis and my bicep, and I can move my humerus and my ulna and my radius. I can flex the flexors in my forearm, and that will move my fingers. And so in this case, the insertion of these muscles, the origin of these muscles is on my ulna and radius, or sometimes on up here on the humerus even, and the insertions are down in my phalanges in this case. Now, that is a pretty sensible set of definitions. So we have the attachment of the muscle to the bone is defined by what's moving and what's not. We have the origin that's not moving, the insertion that is. Here's where it gets a little bit confusing, is that these can actually flip-flop. So the origin and the insertion aren't defined by any anatomical structure, but rather the function that they serve and the motion that's produced. So in the case of the example here, where someone is standing, let's say you're doing a curl, in this case, the origin's on the humerus and the insertion is on the ulna, because the ulna is the bone that's moving. Now, let's pretend for a second that I'm going to do a chin-up. If I was a better instructor, I'd have a chin-up bar in here and do a demonstration, but we'll save that for another day. Imagine I'm going to do a chin-up, right? In this case, I'm actually flexing those same muscles, and I'm producing the same motion. But in this case, as I do a chin-up, it's actually my ulna and my radius that are stationary, and my humerus that's flexing, because my forearms are remaining perpendicular to the ground, and I'm moving myself up like this, right? So that's the action of the same muscle, but in that case, the origin is actually going to be on the ulna, and the insertion is going to be on the humerus, because in that case, the ulna is remaining stationary, and it's the humerus that's moving. So want to emphasize these are functional and not anatomical definitions. In other words, you can't look at the attachment of a muscle to a bone and say, that's the insertion or that's the origin. You need to know what kind of motion is being produced. And then from there, you can describe the origin as being the attachment that's more stationary, and the insertion as being the attachment that's more, that's moving. It's movable. Sound good? And you'll see this is true. There's different ways you can move your leg muscles and things like that, where the insertion and origin can switch depending on what motion is being produced. And I'll give you some more examples of that here in lecture and also in lab. So another example is the Sartorius. The Sartorius has its origin up here on the iliac crest of your coxal bone. So a little refresher here. There's a coxal bone. You're familiar with this. Its insertion is up here on this part of the iliac of the coxal bone on the iliac crest. And this muscle extends all the way down here and has its insertion on the anterior face of your tibia. And just to share the promise that I made, to come through in the promise I made at the beginning of class, this is the longest muscle in your body. And you can think about it next time you're standing up, think about its origin is here, kind of right on the edge of your coxal bone, and its insertion is all the way down here. So in some cases, it can be, I don't know what a meter, close to a meter long. So this is the longest muscle in your body. The root word comes from the word to sew, or for tailor, I think maybe even in Latin. And it's thought that it's because tailors used to sit like this, and that's kind of the muscle that is kind of stretched kind of along your inner thigh there when you're sitting like this, hence the name Sartorius. So just want to give you another example of an insertion and an origin in a muscle, and also reveal what the longest muscle in the body is. So with that in mind, here are examples of 3 of the 4 muscles of your quadriceps. We'll actually look at these in lab. We do this, no, in 2 weeks we do this. We do forelimbs first, we do hind limbs, and you'll see these on your cats. The 3 of the 4 muscles of your quadriceps are your vastus lateralis, your vastus intermedius, and your vastus medialis. And so looking at these, just take a second and think about what is the origin and what is the insertion of these muscles. Let's see if you can think about that, what that would be, just looking at that diagram. And also thinking about the action they produce. In this case, the action they produce is when they contract, it extends the lower half of your leg. It provides extension at the knee. So in this case, the origin of these muscles is all going to be on the greater trochanter of your femur. Let me go back and show you that, right? Because the origin is the part that's stationary. If you're producing, in this case, action like this, it's the tibia and fibula that are moving, not your femur. And so the origin is going to be up there on the head of the femur. And then the insertion is going to be down here, actually attaching, they kind of merge together, and basically there's an Aponeurosis that's formed here around the patella, and then that attaches down to the tibia. And so their insertion is actually going to be on the tibia. So just wanted to give another example. You can think about this. Again, you don't need to know the names of these muscles. Well, you will eventually. But right now, what I'm interested in is understanding the general concept of insertion and origin and give an example. And this is a cool example too, because you can see these muscles attached to the tibia, but via all of these tendons here that go over the kneecap and in which the patella is embedded. I'm going to pause there because we're going to transition and talk about the structure of skeletal muscles, but let me see what questions you have first. Go, Jay.
So when you tear a muscle, is it more likely to tear at the origin or the insertion?
That's a great question. Is it more likely to tear at the origin or the insertion? The answer is really neither. If it's most likely to tear somewhere kind of in the muscle. You can tear at an insertion or an origin, but those attachments are really, really strong connective tissue. Not that they can't break, but you're more likely to injure the muscle or produce a tear somewhere in the actual muscle fibers. But to answer your question, is it more likely to get an injury at insertion or an origin? That's a great question. I don't know. It would depend on the nature of the injury, I think. I don't know if one is more prone to kind of pulling apart than the other. Good. Other questions? All right, let's talk about the gross anatomy of skeletal muscles. So we talked last lecture about how muscles are arranged, muscle fibers are arranged in bundles called fascicles. Now, you can actually see the arrangement of fascicles with your naked eye. And if you've ever looked at, a piece of chicken leg or something that you've cut open, you can see that these bundles of muscle fibers. And the way that the fibers are arranged determines their function. And so an example here is when fascicles are arranged in concentric rings. It's called circular, not surprising. And these are generally found in sphincters to open and close openings, right? So a great example of this is the Orbicularis Oris, which is this muscle kind of just basically in your lips around your mouth, right? And this allows you to like pucker your lips and do all kinds of funny things with your lips. And so because these fascicles are arranged in a circle, it allows you to open and close that opening, right? We see similar arrangements in other parts of the body as well, but this is kind of a convenient example and one that you can easily play with. So that's the first arrangement of skeletal muscles. So I'm going to make a list here. All this arrangements of skeletal muscle. First we have a circular. That one is pretty obviously defined, circular. Next, we have what's called convergent. This is when the origin of the muscle is really, really broad, and then all of the fascicles kind of come together at a more narrow insertion point. And this gives the muscle this kind of fan shape. And so a good example of this is your Pectoralis Major, your pec right here. You have this broad insertion along the sternum, and all of these muscle fibers continue down and have, excuse me, I misspoke. You have this broad origin at the sternum here, and all of the muscle fibers that are attached to the sternum converge and come down here and have a very narrow insertion point on your humerus. And this is called convergent, simply because they converge and come together. Let's see, can we see that in the video? There we go. Importantly here, in the case of convergent muscle fibers or muscle structure, the fibers run the full length of the muscle, meaning that they start here at the origin and they continue all the way down there to the insertion, even as they kind of come together at that insertion. The next arrangement is called parallel. Again, these are pretty nice terms because they describe exactly what the arrangement is. In this case, the fascicles run side by side along the long axis of the muscle. And in this case, sometimes they kind of are thicker in the middle. It forms what's called a belly. So for example, your biceps brachii, or they can be kind of more thin without forming like a bulge in the middle. In that case, we call them strap-like. So we have fusiform that have this wider middle and strap-like that is more longer and thin, as you see in your Sartorius. Again, in the case of parallel muscle, the fibers run the entire length of the muscle from the origin down to the insertion, and the origin down to the insertion. These muscles are really good at producing well, let me talk about the function in a minute. Let me talk about the shapes, and we'll get to the function. Two more muscle structures are pennate, and I'm actually just going to kind of put these together. No, they're slightly different. Pennate and unipennate. Pennate actually comes from the word for feather, which is also our word for pen, because they used to make the pens out of the feathers, like the, what do they call them? Like the quill. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Couldn't think of that word. So this is when the fascicles are short and they attach obliquely to a tendon, meaning they're not parallel, but rather kind of running, not necessarily at right angles, but at an angle to the tendon. And this gives the muscle kind of this feathered appearance that you see here. So an example is your extensor digitorum longus. And so this is going to be the muscle that allows you to extend your toes. I can't really show you because I have sneakers on, but to move your toes up. And the way it runs is all of these fibers run kind of at this angle to the tendon. Pennate muscles can be broken down into unipennate, and then I'll show you bipennate on the next slide. Unipennate you see here, which basically means those muscle fibers, the fascicles, are moving off just one side of that tendon, as you see here. Bipennate is when you have the same structure, but they come off both sides of the tendon. So a good example of this is your rectus femoris, which is this big meaty muscle right in your thigh. It's one of the muscles of your quadricep. And you can see here on this diagram, it's not super clear, but if you look carefully, you can see that the muscle fibers don't run all the way down from the origin to the insertion. Rather, they're kind of running off at this angle here. And so those fibers don't extend the entire length of the muscle. Rather, they're shorter and they run more oblique. And I'll talk about the function of this more in a second, but this allows you to produce more force when you contract those muscles. Sure. So pennate muscles can be divided as unipennate. I'm going to do this. Rearrange my notes here. Unipennate, bipennate, and then also what's called multipennate. You can probably guess what that looks like. This is unipennate because the fibers are just coming off one side. Next, we have bipennate coming off both sides. Then you can imagine multipennate looks like this. So the deltoid, this big muscle on your shoulder where you get your shots, that has all of these tendons and then a whole bunch of these kind of bundles of fascicles associated with each tendon that are running obliquely from each of those tendons. And there's a whole bunch of them, so it's called multipennate. So we've got circular, convergent, parallel, and then 3 different kinds of pennate muscles. Just give you a little more detail about the deltoid, just for fun. This deltoid muscle, remember, has its origin on your clavicle. So it's attached right here. We talked about the clavicle as being part of your shoulder girdle. And it's also attached to the acromion of your scapula. So it's here and here, has its origin. And then its insertion is actually on your humerus. Just to make a connection here, we talked about this deltoid tuberosity was one of the features of the humerus. You looked at this in lab. And this is the insertion point of your deltoid muscle. And so that insertion is basically like kind of right here in your humerus. So when you contract your deltoid, it allows you to abduct or adduct your arms. Abduct, yep, move them up. So to summarize here, we have these different shapes of muscle, different arrangements of fascicles that provide different shapes of muscles. And it's important functionally because it represents a trade-off of distance moved versus power, right? So it's a classical mechanical trade-off. Those of you that have taken physics, you've probably covered this in physics at some point, or Newtonian physics. Muscles can move things over a long distance with not a lot of power, or they can move things over a short distance with a lot of power. And so here you can see that your parallel, convergent, this is also parallel here, it's your Sartorius, and even your circular arrangement allow for moving your, allow the muscles to move over a greater distance. So muscles can contract about 1/3 of their resting length. And so if all of these fascicles are in the same direction, that provides a greater distance of contraction. Contrarily, on the other hand, if they have these short fascicles that are at angles to the tendons, as you see there in the pennate muscles, the unipennate, bipennate, and multipennate, then when those fascicles contract, they don't contract over such a long distance, but you have more fascicles working to produce that contraction. And so you have greater force or greater power. So functionally, these different arrangements represent a trade-off between the distance they can move and the power that's produced. Okay, perfect. I've got a couple more slides here. I want to talk a little bit more about these muscle attachments, and then we're going to do a short activity. So muscles, as I mentioned, attach to the origins and insertions, to the bones at the origins and insertions, better said, by connective tissue. And this can take two forms. The first is called the direct attachment, or sometimes a fleshy attachment. I usually just say direct. Fleshy sounds kind of weird to me. In this case, the connective fibers are short, and so it almost looks like the fascicles, the muscle itself, is connected to the bone. So you see an example here in the brachialis that we talked about earlier. The muscle comes really close to the bone here. There are important connective tissues there binding it to the bone, but there's not a lot of them. The other kind of attachment, as you might guess, if you have a direct attachment, what's the other kind of attachment? Indirect, boom. That is when you have a longer, the connective tissue is longer between the muscle and the bone. And so this is referred to as a tendon. So this is this connective tissue that forms a cord-like structure that connects the muscle to the bone. And in some cases, this can be really long. So for example, I gave you the example earlier of the extensor muscle. It's right down here, just in your lower limb. And when that muscle essentially ends somewhere in here, and there's these long tendons that run through your ankle out to your toes to allow you to extend your toes. So in that case, the tendon can be almost as long as the muscle itself. Now, those tendons, if you recall from lecture on Wednesday, can also, instead of being these thin cord-like structures, they can also become these flat sheet-like structures. That's called an aponeurosis. And we see examples of that. I gave you an example of this on Wednesday in the muscles of the back. We also see this kind of sheet of connective tissue associated with the knee. And in this case, specifically the aponeurosis for the insertion of the Sartorius on your tibia. And just to bring us back a little bit to what we covered in lab, we talked about these different features on bones, such as tubercles, trochanters, crests, tuberosities, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to make the connection here that these structures on your bone, these landmarks, are important because this is where muscles attach, right? And so a good example here is we have this greater tubercle. This is a humerus, right? Is this a right or a left humerus? The right, anterior, posterior? Posterior. So it's going to be, you're looking at someone whose humerus is like this. You can tell by the condyle there. And so here, the greater tubercle, we talked about this in lab. This is where muscles of your rotator cuff that provide movement in your shoulder attach. The deltoid tuberosity I mentioned earlier, that's where your deltoid attaches and allows you to abduct your arm. Then you have the epicondyles, some of the muscles of your forearms attached there. On your femur, we talked about muscles that have their origin at the greater trochanter, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to make the connection, the functional connection between these landmarks you saw on the bone and why they're actually there and what they do. And they are where those muscles attach to provide that movement. Sound good? All right, let's do this. So you're going to grab a partner or groups of three, no bigger than three, please. And I want you to quiz each other. So you're going to flex a muscle. You're going to demonstrate flexing a muscle. And then you're going to work through where the insertion and origin is. Now, you don't have to know the exact spot. You don't have to be like, that's the greater tuberosity, blah, blah, blah. But just kind of think about what bone it might be attached to and even where on the bone. You know, if you're going to flex your bicep, you might not know exactly where your bicep inserts in your ulnar radius, but you know that it's in the proximal end of your ulnar radius. So just kind of think through some examples of this a little bit. Sound good? A couple minutes to quiz each other. And I'll go around and check in. Let's see, Jada and just and then Sarah and your traps, you guys cool. Me back there. Marge, how you doing? You guys are gonna be yeah. Don't do the biceps. You did that one already. Yeah.
I like it.
Thank you. And they have their the insertion is on the tendon here. That's all right, let's bring it back. Just a chance to try out some ideas and move around a little bit. What did anything stump you? Got any questions about what you're doing there? Yeah, please. So
like your foot, you're like.
Yep.
Here and the down here, or is it almost on the foot?
That's a great question. So if you're producing generally any motion in the limbs, the muscle that produces that motion is in the more proximal segment of your limb. So if you're flexing your foot like this, the muscles that do that are going to be here. If I'm extending my leg here at the knee, the muscles that produce that movement are going to be here. If I'm flexing at the hip, then those muscles are going to be up here. Did that answer your question? Is that?
So is the origin up here?
Yeah, so on those extensors there, that origin is going to be up here on the proximal end of your tibia, but also some of those actually extend up and have their insertion on the femur as well. Got you.
Over here or like over here?
Good question. The origin of these muscles, and we'll see this actually, we'll dissect our cats this week and see the origin of these flexors is actually down here on the ulna and the radius. And the muscles, the bulk of those muscles are in your forearm, and then just the long tendons go up through your wrist. Remember we talked about like carpal tunnel syndrome where I'll have all of those tendons and nerves in a little small area in your wrist, and then extends kind of across the metacarpal here, and then inserts on the phalanges. And so there's like all of these tendons that go up into your hand. Let me find an image. If we can find an image of a hand with just the bones and the tendons, it's really pretty neat because there's all these tendons that go, and there's a tendon that goes to your distal phalanx, to the middle phalanx, to the proximal phalanx, et cetera, for each of your digits. So it's pretty complicated and pretty cool there. But you don't really have any muscles in your hand. All those muscles are in your forearm. Good, great questions. Do you ever see that magician that sticks the ice pick through his hand? David Blaine, you ever see? That totally creeps me out. It's not even, it's like he just like learned there's a spot in his hand and he just like practiced over years, like sticking the ice pick through there. Anyway, sorry. What's that? Well, he has like scar tissue. If you do it in just the right spot, you can miss those tendons and nerves and like stick it through. And I mean, it's still painful, but that's why he's on TV and we're not. But the trick is there because you have all of these things kind of running parallel through your hand. If you get just the right spot, I don't know what that spot is. I'm not going to try it, but you can kind of get it right through there. Yeah, try. That's next lab. If you get it through, then you get full credit of a quiz. Stick this ice pick to your hand. Did I see hand true? Did you have a question? Yeah. Okay. So the latissimus dorsi, the muscles of your back here, you have the insertion is actually up here on your humerus because those are the muscles. These are like your swimming muscles, right? When you see swimmers and they have like, they come out of the pool and they have like these giant wide backs, that's because their latissimus dorsi are just enormous. And because that muscle inserts on your humerus there, and so it provides this motion when you're swimming, it actually provides the back pulling motion when you're swimming. And so that produces a lot of force. And then you have the origin is kind of all down the spine, kind of on that aponeurosis that runs along the spine there. And we'll actually look at those guys in your cat this week coming up in lab on Tuesday. Yeah, Jada.
Like, are they messing with the doctors and obviously? Are they trying to release the muscle at the origin of the finger?
Trigger finger? I'm not.
Like your finger gets stuck.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, yeah, then that suggests that the muscle that's providing for that is that motion, that flexor is somehow contracted permanently. So I guess you'd have to release it somehow, but I don't know exactly. So you mean if the finger is just kind of like this? Yeah.
I got to see an open knee replacement. And
Did you really?
Yeah.
That's. Yeah.
Like this man's like first like his fingers were like stuck like this, so like he had to like cut open the palm of his hand. I didn't get to see very well because I'm short, but I didn't know like what he was messing with.
Yeah. Yeah, you could probably just somehow detach the tendon and extend it somehow surgically, and then that would kind of release that pressure, would be my guess anyway. Huh. It's called trigger finger. I never heard that term for. Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense though. Yeah. Cool. All right. So I want to go back and think about remind you that the skeletal muscles are voluntary for the most part. But just because we call a muscle voluntary doesn't mean that you can always get exactly the muscle that you want to do exactly what you want, because there are some mechanical trade-offs here. And also the way that your muscles are innervated doesn't allow you to necessarily produce certain movements. And you'll notice that when you thought in this exercise just now, this is actually a really important idea. You did not think about, if you're gonna, I'm gonna just go back to this example. If you're flexing your arm here, you don't think consciously about contracting your brachialis and your biceps brachii. What you think about is moving your arm, right? And that's because to produce that movement, you need those two muscles to contract, you need your triceps to relax, you need a whole bunch of things to happen at once. And your brain is wired to your muscles in such a way that you don't have to think about each of those individual things. You can just think about moving your arms. That's why it takes a long time, for example, for babies to become coordinated, to understand how they can move their body through space, because their brain, essentially all of those pathways are becoming synchronized and kind of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Kind of correlated, right? And so that eventually the baby learns that it can think and move its arm in a certain way and do that. Whereas at first, when newborns are born, they just kind of flail around, right? They don't really have that kind of control. And so, yeah, I just want to emphasize that when we consciously control these muscles, we think of them as voluntary, but we're not really voluntarily controlling muscles individually. I mean, you kind of can in some cases, like you can consciously think about, you know, all right, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to flex my triceps, right? And you can flex that triceps. But when you're generally moving through space, you're not thinking about it in an individual term, because all of these muscles need to work together. And so I just gave the example of the forearm of what needs to happen for that forearm to move. If your triceps contracts at the same time as your biceps, then your arm's not going to move at all. You're going to have this kind of isometric force created where the muscles are going to counteract each other and you're not going to move at all, even as both of them do contract. Additionally, we don't have, we can't always get muscles to do what we want to do because of mechanical restrictions. So for example, if you put your thumb and your forefinger together, so you produce this opposition movement we talked about in lab, right? And kind of push down. If you're holding something, it actually helps a little bit because then you're producing force. Now get your other 3 fingers to relax. So pinch down hard between your index finger and your thumb, and then get these ones to relax. You can't. If you're going to push down here and produce a lot of force, these 3 fingers are also going to be tense. You can, if you relax them, then I'll drop the chalk, right? So you can't simultaneously create strong force here and relax these. And that's because of the way all of those tendons are interrelated and how the extensors of your fingers are related, right? And so they're voluntary muscles, but it doesn't mean we can get each of them to do exactly what we want it to do when we want it to do it. Just some examples. When we produce movements, we have muscles working in different roles to produce those movements. And let's see here, what time is it? I don't have a ticket out today. I might cover just a couple more slides here and introduce this idea. We'll pick it up on Monday. So when we produce these movements, we're coordinating all of our muscles in different roles. And there's 4 major categories or roles that muscles play when we produce movement. The first is called the prime mover or the agonist. That's the one that's doing the bulk of the work to produce a movement. Then we have the antagonist, which is the muscle on the opposite side of that joint that needs to relax to produce a movement. Then we have something called a fixator, which is a muscle maybe in another part of the body that has to flex to produce stability. And finally, we have a synergist, which is a muscle that kind of helps out the prime mover do its thing. So I'll talk about each of these in more detail coming up, but I just want to introduce those 4 terms, and then we can talk about give some examples of what muscles play these roles in different movements. So the prime mover or agonist is the muscle that produces the primary action. So example, when you clench your fist, you have the flexors of your pollex or your thumb and the flexors of your digits. And these are the primary muscles that are producing this movement. And if you do this, this is actually a good demonstration. If you go ahead, hold your arm out like this, make a fist. Now feel your forearm right here. Those muscles are flexed. These are the muscles, the flexors of your pollex and your digits that produce this movement. So you notice that the force is actually produced here. Again, those long tendons go through your wrists and attach to the bones of your fingers, but this is the part of your arm that's flexed in that case. Another example, if you flex your arm at the shoulder, your pectoralis major is the prime mover here. So if I'm flexing my arm like this, it's my pectoralis major that's producing most of that force. So those are the prime movers or agonists. On the other hand, we have, antagonists are the muscles that need to relax to produce a movement. And so in the example I gave earlier, we flex the arm at the elbow, the triceps brachii needs to relax. So if you go ahead and flex your arm and then feel your triceps, it's nice and floppy here, right? At the same time, the example I gave earlier, if you're flexing your arm at the shoulder, you're flexing your pectoralis major. This is your agonist. The antagonist is the latissimus dorsi. That muscle needs to relax so you can flex your arm forward. If you're extending your arm, then that latissimus dorsi becomes the agonist and the pectoralis major becomes the antagonist. Now, the word antagonist applies some kind of like opposition. It makes it sound bad, like if you're an antagonist, you're causing a lot of trouble or making problems for people. In this context, though, it has a different meaning, and it's really important to think about the antagonist as actually helping the movement. And what I mean by that is that if the antagonist doesn't relax in a controlled way, then your movements are uncontrolled. So for example, if I'm going to flex my biceps, but my triceps is just going to be completely relaxed without providing any counterforce, then I'm just going to go like this. Like I'm not going to have any fine scale control. It's that balance between the contraction of the agonist and the antagonist that allows you to move in a controlled way and get more precise movements. So I gave that example. Another example would be the extensors, excuse me, of your pollex and digits are antagonists to the flexors of those digits. And so a good example here, let me see if I can do this demonstration. If you, I don't want to do this. If you, well, I'm actually going to skip that demonstration. Oh, all right, yeah, I'll do this demonstration. So if you you make a fist and hold your fist up like this on the table here, and then you move your wrist down, you can't keep your fist as a fist when you're all the way down here because of the way those the antagonists in this case have a limit to how far that they can stretch. And so you can't have your wrist down like this and make a tight fist at the same time. You can make it up when your wrist is like this, but as you move down, that fist becomes looser and looser because those antagonists are limited. In that case, the extensors of your pollex and your digits. So agonist, antagonist, it sounds like they're working against each other, but really they're working together to produce fluid and controlled movements. I think that's a good place to stop. I want to just offer a couple reminders here as you go into your weekend. Look at all this fun stuff. We'll get to this Monday. On Monday, I'm going to have open hours, but only 1 to 2 instead of noon to 2. And the reason for that is don't miss the I-Cubed event. If any of you have never been to it before, it's in Great Chapel from noon to 1. Different professors from the university across all different places come, and they give 3-minute talks on some area of their research. It's super fun. It's really cool. I'm looking forward to it. So be sure to check that out Monday. Jada, go ahead. Okay. Mm-hmm.
When you get your leg amputated from like your knee down, will it mess with the shape of that muscle because it's connected there?
Yeah, for sure. So when they do that surgically, I don't know exactly what they do, but they would have to take the end of that muscle and somehow kind of maybe bind it to the end of the femur or something like that.
Oh.
Yep, for sure though, too. That's a good question because it extends across the knee. So I-Cubed, also remember Danny's got tutorial sessions. You'll have a quiz in lab next Tuesday. So Monday night, he's got a review session. Promise you the greatest Venn diagram of all time. You ready for it? That's good, right? With the key guitar, the keytar, yeah. I knew. It's so good. Oh.